MI6 know all the information, the CIA know, the Mossad knows it, and the same, the Ziem Bureau, the band. And it's time for action. Facing such an attack, we cannot but act. And these terror thugs and rogue leaders are highly skillful in identifying the slightest cracks in the wheel of power or power of will of the leaders of the free world.
But let me press this point about democracy and the price democracy may have to pay, because you know very well that many passengers in the United States have long expected to be able to walk into an airport, get on a domestic aircraft unhindered within about 10 minutes of the plane taking off. They expect that as a free country.
And it's a part of the problem that we have in a world which is so turbulent that we won't be able to isolate our advanced way of life from what happens around. And it's a time to launch a operational, concrete war against terror, even if it takes certain pains from the routine activities of our normal society.
Now, Mr. Barak, you have deep problems, great attention in the Middle East at the moment, but you've used there a war against this kind of terrorism. What can be done? Because the great thing that is talked about by people like you, diplomats, politicians, world leaders, is preventing conflict before it happens. When you talk about a war, how do you take a war or a challenge or a struggle to those who are determined, through 3 or 4 people only today, to hijack 4 planes at least, as we know, hit the Pentagon, hit the World Trade Center, try and hit, we believe, somewhere else? How do you take a war to 4 people?
I spent decades struggling terror, almost, with my 10 fingers, together with a lot of colleagues all around the world. I believe that the world intelligence community, in a concerted effort, can identify within few months the sources of this terror. They can identify the places where they are deployed on Earth. Every such a place is within certain country. Bin Laden sits in Afghanistan. There is a source of terror.
Who else do you identify, though? Because we're not saying he's responsible for this necessarily.
No, we don't say that he's necessarily responsible. We know where other terror thugs are living. We know that Ferganskaya Dolina in Central Asia is a major route for drugs, but at the same time major route for terror. And I know that President Putin is highly committed to the struggle against terror, and I feel that he should be part of this international effort. I believe that the MI6 is highly capable. You have proven it along decades. Your own skills in standing firm politically and acting pointedly, operationally against terror. And we should cooperate with
preemptively?
Both preemptive and by diplomatic means, namely rogue states. There are 5 of them: Iran, Iraq, Libya, North Korea. These kind of states should be treated as rogue states. And the same applies even to leaders like Arafat. We've heard him just recently condemning this. I praise him for this condemnation, but he personally is responsible for many terror events that happened in the last few years. Same happened in some other capitals in the Middle East.
That was Ehud Barak, the former Israeli Prime Minister, who was with me in the studio about an hour ago. Now, an update on what we know so far. For those of you who are joining us at this time, there have been 4 incidents involving 4 separate, apparently hijacked aircraft, 2 of which came from Boston. This, believe it or not, is South Manhattan in New York City. Underneath that smoke is what's left of the World Trade Center, the 2 towers, the distinctive twin towers of the World Trade Center, which collapsed after the 2 towers were hit by 2 hijacked aircraft. Both of them had been hijacked from Boston, on routes involving Boston. And shortly after the first tower was hit, about an hour later, it collapsed. Then the second tower collapsed as well. Now, underneath that smoke is where millions of people literally do work, in Wall Street, the heart of New York City. This is the scene of what's left in Wall Street, South Manhattan, along the Hudson River. And at the same time as that was happening, disbelief in Washington when we saw pools of smoke coming up from the Pentagon, the defense headquarters of all the U.S. defense systems. There you see the smoke rising. This happened about half an hour later, just across the Potomac River from the White House. A third plane, presumably hijacked, had flown into the outer rim of this building, close to the helicopter site. And shortly after that, we had news of a fourth aircraft, which we now know to be a United Airlines aircraft, which came down, a 767, which came down in southern Pennsylvania, about 80 miles from Pittsburgh. 4 incidents, therefore: panic, devastation, enormous numbers of injuries, and one has to assume enormous numbers of deaths, both in the south of New York City. Doctors talking enormous numbers of people who have been admitted to hospital, particularly with extensive burns. And across the whole of Washington, D.C., equal panic. No massive crumbling buildings. They don't have that many high-rise buildings in Washington, D.C., but panic right around the main agencies of state, across the White House, Congress, the State Department, as an evacuation plan was put into operation. And large numbers of government officers and civil servants were ordered to evacuate, fearing that there were other planes up there in the skies over the eastern seaboard, even though the Federal Aviation Administration had, shortly after 10 to 9, after the first incident, had shut down all the airspace and ordered that all planes land and that none take off. Well, that's the scene an hour or so ago at the Pentagon, across the river from Washington, D.C. Panic, really, I think it's fair to say, in both Washington, D.C. and New York City. The mayor of New York City, Rudy Giuliani, has ordered an evacuation of the whole of southern Manhattan. One has to remember that even the emergency services have probably been devastated by this, because they had turned up at the World Trade Center. We saw many of them earlier, and they were covered with smoke and soot and dust. And one has to assume, as they were attending the World Trade Center trying to rescue people, and the first tower collapsed, that many of them might have perished as well. You can see in those images, this is video we've just received, video just to the left of that concrete pillar in white, someone in the World Trade Center desperate for some kind of rescue, but I suspect above the limit of ladders and even helicopters, impossible at that time. That is the one standing building, I think, of the World Trade Center. The 2 other, even more distinctive towers have collapsed following their being hit. You can see that person waving desperately, and these were the scenes at the World Trade Center within half an hour after the 2 civilian passenger aircraft hijacked had been flown directly in to both towers. Unbelievable though it may seem for those of you who are just joining and are unaware of what has happened in the last 3.5 hours. Well, I'm joined by Mike Bluestone, who is a counter-terrorism expert. As you sit here, Mike, watching a scene like that, which we thought only Hollywood special effects people could dream up, you must be wondering, with your clients, what do you advise them after this has happened in the heart of the civilized world and the heart of the world's financial systems?
Well, I would advise any public or private corporation to take a very serious review of their contingency plans and security methods generally in the light of this. I mean, as we speak, we're looking at these tremendous casualties and the devastation there. But as we speak, multidisciplinary crisis management teams consisting of many security professionals and other managers will be sitting down now in other places planning how to try to get back to normality over the coming days. We don't yet know the number of casualties, we don't yet know the number of fatalities, but even looking at the scale of this this tragedy and the enormity of the damage, there's still going to be plenty of other buildings and areas where some kind of normality can resume within a reasonable period of time. I can't tell you how long that period of time is going to be, but I'm confident that those crisis management teams are working to restore normality as we speak.
But here we have essentially the civilian systems beginning to shut down, train travel from Boston to Washington suspended. Canada has closed its airports, understandable, I suppose, but creating a major problem for any planes flying the Atlantic at the moment. Where do they actually head for? So you're talking about an amazing knock-on right through the civilized world on this.
Absolutely. There's going to be a knock-on through the civilized world.
That's not an overstatement.
It's not. And there's going to be a lot of precautionary measures that swing into place very quickly. Some of them might seem very draconian. There will be a total shutdown of many activities, certainly in the transport, telecoms and tourist sectors, but equally other sectors will be able to get back to some kind of normality within the next 2 or 3 days.
What do you mean by normality?
Operations. There will be crisis management to make sure that there is some kind of business continuity that's different from total business recovery. Full recovery will take a long time.
What about the human cost here? We're talking about the World Trade Towers, 50,000 people working there alone. Now, not all of them have got to work yet.
No.
But we're talking about homes, families, insurance, houses, lives, everything.
Absolutely. The knock-on effect is economic, it's socio-economic, it's political, and it affects the whole of the community.
Well, Mike Bluestone, for the moment, thank you. Let's now get a reflection on the impact of this, terrorism as such. Let's now go live to our studio in Dundee, in the east of central Scotland, to Professor Paul Wilkinson, Director of the Centre for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence at St Andrews University. Paul Wilkinson, welcome to BBC World. Here we apparently have maybe 4, maybe 6, maybe 8 people who've hijacked 4 aircraft and created devastation in the 2 strategic financial, economic, political centres on the eastern seaboard of the United States. What's your reflection?
Well, it is clearly the worst and most tragic and lethal attack by international terrorists in the history of terrorism. It clearly shows a very serious escalation in the use of aviation terrorism. Here you have the terrorists not just threatening to turn the planes they've hijacked into bombs, but actually using their aeroplanes in that way. And of course, as a method of creating mass casualties, it is demonstrated to be extremely lethal. And of course, there is a danger that they have similar plans to stage further attacks, and a danger that other groups may emulate them. So this is, again, an illustration of the vulnerability of modern civil aviation and the way in which modern airliners may be turned into weapons by ruthless terrorists prepared to commit suicide in the course of attacks.
Now, Professor Wilkinson, this is more than civil aviation, isn't it? This is actually an attack on civilization, almost. That's what we've been hearing from a senior figure who was working in the Clinton administration on counterterrorism. He said this is worse than the doomsday scenario that he and his colleagues in the National Security Council had been working on.
Well, I can imagine that. I think it is a declaration of war, as Hanan Ashwari said earlier, on the civilian population, and it is particularly tragic to see mass terrorism developing in this way. It makes one wonder what we are likely to see in the 21st century. We must, I think, get our international act together, working with other countries on exchanging intelligence, preventing terrorism, and taking the necessary firm legal measures under the rule of law to do our utmost to prevent the activities that lead to this kind of mass terrorist attack.
Paul Wilkinson, in the end, though, people in governments, in diplomacy, in political chancelleries around the world, they have to examine intelligence. They have to examine signals intelligence, human intelligence. They also have to work out intent. What do you believe the intent of this was? Was it political or something else?
I think there was political intent behind it from a group or groups fanatically opposed to the United States, and I suspect groups that are particularly opposed to American policy in the Middle East, and particularly perhaps in the Arabian Peninsula. I suspect that a group with those kind of motivations will be found to be behind it, although we will have to wait until we have firm evidence as to who was responsible. But that must be the prime suspect, I think.
Professor Paul Wilkinson, thanks for joining us from the Centre for Study of Terrorism at St Andrews University. You were joining us from Dundee in Scotland. Now let me update on what has happened